cresci no interior de Minas Gerais, numa cidadezinha chamada São José do Buriti. É uma cidade muito pequena.
Eu sou de Fortaleza, nascido e criado em Fortaleza. Estudava numa escola de bairro, depois mudei para uma escola maior.
E eu tinha sonhos de estudar, muito porque minha mãe não tinha tido oportunidade de estudar. E ela sempre me incentivou muito.
Eu sempre estudei em escolas públicas, né? Eu venho de uma família de baixa renda. Ao longo do meu ensino médio, eu cursei ensino técnico em administração, integrado ao médio, numa ETEC do interior de São Paulo.
E eu entrei no site, eu vi que tinha um programa de bolsas. Eu me apaixonei pela escola, me apaixonei pela visão da escola. E eu vi que eu me enquadrava no perfil.
Por acaso, eu acabei conhecendo o INSPER, acabei entrando no site do INSPER, fiquei completamente apaixonada pelo curso de engenharia que tinha aquela proposta hands-on, aquela proposta mão na massa, uma proposta completamente disruptiva para um curso de engenharia no Brasil, e eu resolvi prestar o programa de bolsas.
Eu descobri o INSPER, cara, eu já estava fazendo faculdade lá em Fortaleza, descobri que existia a faculdade, o INSPER, descobri o programa de bolsas, me inscrevi, passei e vim.
No dia que saiu a resposta da bolsa, né, eu tava ansiosa, esperando, falei, meu Deus, o que vai acontecer? Liguei pra minha mãe e falei, mãe, passei, já sei qual faculdade que eu quero ir, agora não preciso escolher mais, porque eu tenho certeza que é o INSPER.
Eu nunca senti algo antes como aquilo. Pra mim era a concretização de todos os sonhos que aquela menina tinha. E naquele momento, eu não sabia que a minha vida ia mudar tanto.
Primeiro, a primeira coisa, se não existisse bolsa, não existia Ernesto no INSPER, entendeu? Não tem como, não fazia, estava muito longe da nossa realidade, então acho que poder entrar numa universidade da qualidade do INSPER só foi possível para mim pela bolsa.
O grande objetivo do programa de bolsas, né, do ponto de vista institucional, era trazer diversidade para o corpo discente. Na verdade, criar um corpo discente, construir um corpo discente diverso, de ideias, de propósitos, de visão de mundo.
O que eu acho que é uma das grandes qualidades da população brasileira, que é a capacidade de lidar com a diversidade. E todos nós sabemos a quantidade de talentos que estão por aí mundo afora e que obviamente não têm oportunidade. Aliás, esse é um dos problemas do Brasil, tolerância e oportunidade.
É uma realidade mesmo que a depender do CEP onde você nasce vai destinar seu futuro. Isso é inadmissível.
Todas as pessoas que nascem no Brasil têm que ter as mesmas oportunidades para realizar seus sonhos. Não importa se elas nascem na periferia de São Paulo, na zona rural no Nordeste, em bairros ricos, todos têm que ter a mesma oportunidade.
A gente começou a colocar esforços onde estão esses talentos acadêmicos, porque a questão financeira a escola estava preparada para suprir, e a parte deles era trazer o gosto pelo estudo, a curiosidade intelectual, acreditar na educação como meio de geração de possibilidades para eles na vida, e a gente teve o desafio então de investigar e procurar esse pessoal. Até no Ceará a gente foi parar, né?
O mundo ele é muito maior do que essas 8 quadras que cercam a faculdade. E trazer gente de fora, você traz, cara, perspectivas diferentes de problemas, você traz novos problemas para dentro da faculdade. Eu acho que tem um ganho de ter diversidade dentro do corpo de alunos, que é super importante para a formação, tanto como profissionais, mas para a formação cidadã também, que eu acho que a faculdade faz parte disso.
A história do INSPER é uma trajetória, as coisas vão acontecendo, é um processo. Então nós temos vários marcos. Um marco importante foi a criação das nossas bolsas não restituíveis integrais. Outro marco aí foi mais gradual, é o engajamento progressivo dos nossos ex-alunos, chamados alumni, no nosso fundo de bolsa. Nós temos um número crescente de alumni que hoje contribuem para o Fundo de Bolsas, o que nos deixa extremamente felizes e orgulhosos. Outro marco importante foi a Toca da Raposa, que foi o primeiro dormitório que nós tivemos aqui no INSPER, voltado para os bolsistas integrais.
Para pessoas como eu, que são de fora de São Paulo, existe a Toca da Raposa, né, que é um residencial incrível que foi construído pelo INSPER para abrigar esses talentos do país inteiro e conseguir viabilizar que essas pessoas estudem no INSPER. Então, é um espaço bastante colaborativo que me possibilita me dedicar integralmente aos estudos no INSPER.
O programa de bolsa permite que essas pessoas, que esses jovens, consigam atingir seus sonhos, cursar os cursos de interesse numa instituição de excelência. E isso vai refletir em toda a vida desses jovens. Do lado da instituição é muito importante porque esses alunos trazem um dinamismo grande para a escola.
O INSPER também é um sonho de quem acredita no Brasil, né? Eu acho que aí todo mundo sai um pouco imbuído dessa vontade de fazer diferença, levando esse senso de pertencimento, esse olhar pragmático para onde a gente vai depois de sair aqui do 4x300.
INSPER, na verdade, vem de inspirar e pertencer. Então, esse pertencer que nós queremos realmente colocar os nossos alunos, que eles pertencem à nossa comunidade. Eles, na realidade, estão ligados à escola perenemente.
Então, a gente colocou muita energia em criar esse senso de comunidade, de engajamento, de amor à camisa, que é independentemente de qualquer contrato, é em outro lugar que está esse compromisso.
Meu sonho também é poder adotar alguém como mentora, como madrinha para o programa de bolsas e poder devolver ao INSPER tudo que eu recebi.
E eu posso acompanhar hoje como doador, como parceiro do INSPER em iniciativas, né? Ter essa troca e poder ajudar pessoas que vêm de uma realidade parecida com a minha, acho que isso para mim é muito legal.
É um grande desafio e nós estamos aqui no INSPER dentro do nosso microcosmo, que é ensino superior, dentro daquilo que nós achamos que podemos fazer bem e adicionar valor, procurando fazer o melhor para contribuir para esse fim.
E eu espero que o programa de bolsas esteja apenas começando, porque é claro que todos nós aqui temos um limite, mas ele de fato cria, enfim, impactos mais que proporcionais.
É muito bom pensar no futuro do programa, né? Daquilo que a gente colhendo os benefícios do que evoluiu até aqui, e o que a gente espera, o que a gente sonha para frente.
Eu acho que hoje trabalhar com a educação é pensar que a oportunidade não pode ser só para alguns, não pode ser para o aluno que já está engajado, tem que ser para engajar um aluno também.
Tem que pensar grande, tem que sonhar. Quanto mais jovens a gente forma, né? Quanto maior a oferta, né, de um programa desse para esses jovens, maior o impacto potencial para o nosso país.
Bom dia a todas e todos. Como informado na divulgação desse evento, ele vai ser conduzido completamente em inglês, não haverá tradução simultânea. Então, eu vou passar para o inglês nesse momento. So, good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here with us. And I want to begin by thanking all our panelists, which I will present with more detail shortly. First, I just want to describe a little bit what's the purpose of this webinar, and then we engage with the panelists. The field of comparative constitutional law has experienced a rebirth and expansion since the 90s, but the scholarly agenda in this field has still largely been shaped by the experiences of a small set of countries, Western liberal democracies such as the United States, France, the United Kingdom, and Germany. But in the same period, recent waves of constitution making and political transitions in many recent democracies have increasingly opened up new possibilities on the field. So in Latin America, for example, which is the focus of our webinar today, beyond typical liberal concerns about the limits of state power, transitions to democracy have encouraged practice of constitution making and constitutional adjudication in which poverty and exclusion, promoting access to justice, and transforming unequal social structures have a central place. So in this scenario, the essays collected in the recent volume, The Global South and Comparative Constitutional Law, seek to reflect and evaluate this new, more plural conversation on constitutional law globally. And what do these new constitutional experiences have to add to the global conversation and perhaps redirect it? So in this webinar, to discuss some of these questions and other related questions, two of the editors of the volume will be joined by scholars of constitutional law from different countries in Latin America for a critical discussion on the main themes and challenges presented in the book. So this webinar is organized by INSPER's Faculty of Law, and we have just received our first cohort of undergrad law students. And it's sponsored as well by the Brazil chapter of the International Society of Public Law, ICONES. So I want to thank our panelists once again. And we brought together here today Ana Micaela Alterio, who is the Associate Professor of Constitutional Law at ITAM in Mexico, Jane Reis, Associate Professor of Constitutional Law at the State University of Rio de Janeiro, Michael Rigner, who's a postdoctoral researcher at the Faculty of Law at Humboldt University, Philip Dunn, the Chair of Public and Comparative Law at Humboldt University in Berlin, and Roberto Gargarella, who is the Associate Professor of Constitutional Law at Universidade de Buenos Aires and full professor at Universidade Torquato de Tella. I will moderate the event, and you can ask questions on our YouTube transmission. So without further delay, I will begin with Michael and Philip. Michael will present, and they are speaking for the organization of the whole book project. Then we'll move to Roberto, and then to the discussion and comments and presentation by Micaela and Jenny. So thank you very much, everybody, for accepting our invitation. It's great to have you guys here. So Michael, please.
Yes, thank you everyone for joining today. Thank you, Diego. Thank you to INSPER. Thank you to our commentators, Micaela and Jane, and thank you, of course, to the authors of our book, represented today here by Roberto, who made all of this possible. I'll just hold this into the camera, and maybe you can see. You can also see the colorful improvements my kids made on this. So we have here a collaborative effort to say, and I speak here only as one of 3 editors and one of the co-authors. We have authors from sort of all over the global south who are based there or hail there. So that I think is the hallmark and the ambition to really have representatives from the global south speak. And if I speak here as one of the editors, of course, that is drawing a lot on these insights and trying to give our own thoughts about this. So from the perspective of the editors, I would like to make 3 points in this introduction from about 15 minutes. And the first is to spell out a little bit the context and the general argument of the book. Namely, the argument that there is and that there should be what we call in the introduction a southern turn in comparative constitutional law, in this discipline and scholarly discourse that Diego already referred to. Secondly, I'd like to explain a little bit more what we think, in our view, may be distinct about constitutionalism in the global south. What context and themes set it apart, but also sort of link it and entangle it with its sort of other, the global north. And then thirdly, I'd reflect a little bit on the implications that such a southern turn and such a distinctive constitutional experience would have for comparative constitutional law more broadly. That is the global discourse on comparative constitutional law and how that might have to be reoriented. So I'll start with this first sort of question: what is the context and the argument of the book? So the immediate context is that the book emerged from a journal anniversary conference. Both Philip and I are the co-editors of a journal now called World Comparative Law, which has been around for 50 years. So this was the 50th anniversary in 2017 that we're celebrating. And the journal is one of the few journals in Europe, at least, that has been dedicated exclusively to legal developments in the global south, and has become over the years sort of platform for this kind of exchange and dialogue that we are also trying to promote here today. And so reflecting on these sort of 5 decades at the time, we felt that there is still a large deficit in comparative constitutional law as a discipline. And Diego already has referred to this deficit. So what is this? On the one hand, it's true that there's been a tremendous growth and then the renaissance of comparative constitutional law over the past 2.5 decades. And that is, of course, closely linked to the globalization generally and to globalization of law and constitutional law. And that has certainly sort of increased the numbers of jurisdictions that are being studied and compared. But we think that it's not enough. And it's not enough both sort of quantitatively, because the US, Canada, Europe still sort of remain the most studied jurisdictions. And even more importantly, they still sort of dominate the epistemic frameworks. So the very comparative categories that we think with and think about when we analyze constitutionalism around the world in North and South. So while over the past decades, I think we've added a lot of new material from the South, we have not necessarily pluralized or even equalized the epistemic and theoretical frameworks. So we're doing, there's a lot of comparative constitutional law for the South, so production of knowledge for the South, but there's less sort of comparison with or even from the perspective of the global South. And I think that's something we're trying to address. So the argument then that we're trying to make has three components. And the first is very simple and plainly, but it still has to be stated, is that to take constitutional law in the global South seriously and to give it the full attention it deserves and understand it on its own terms, not within the frameworks of sort of US, American or European constitutionalism, and not sort of approach Latin America in particular, for example, as a failed law or failed constitutionalism, something that is only to be understood in terms of political science, but it's law and it's constitutional law, and I think we need to take that seriously. The second point would be to pluralize the framework of comparative constitutional law from the perspective of the global South. That is, we think that studying the global South is not an exercise sort of in particularism or in area studies, but it teaches us something and gives us intellectual input into the broader discourse that, as Diego said, is dominated often by sort of notions of liberal constitutionalism. And then there's a debate, is anything that is not liberal even constitutionalism, or do we attach a more or less derogatory adjective to it and call it authoritarian or something? So we want to sort of feed this back into the general discourse. And then lastly, we think that this argument about taking the South seriously and pluralizing the debate is encapsulated by the notion of the global South. So we understand that there is a debate about whether this notion is useful at all, whether it's too heterogeneous, too lumped together, too many different countries or not. And I think we push a bit back against this and say that we think this term is useful for several reasons that we can discuss. It inherits this emancipatory connotation that the third world sort of was conveying at some point, but it also emphasizes, the global emphasizes the entanglements of North and South. So it's not an exercise of sort of othering and differentiating necessarily, but emphasizing the sort of the deep entanglements and dialectical relationships that we have there. And we think that helps. So to sum up this point, you could say that the book tries to do in comparative constitutional law what TWAIL, the third world approaches to international law, have done since the 1990s. So if this becomes at some point a TWAIL moment in hindsight, we would be happy to have achieved this together with the authors. So that's the ambition. So the book makes various offers then on how to proceed with this southern turn, and this organized in two parts, one theoretical and then one more thematically. And the theoretical part has a range of chapters that reflect on the notion of global South and on epistemic framework, on alternative modernities, on the role of comparative constitutional lawyers in this North-South discourse. We have a wonderful contribution by Florian Hoffmann from PUC Rio, for example, and others. The second part of the book then features 7 chapters that develop sort of important distinctive themes that we think define constitutionalism in the global South, such as sort of transformative constitutionalism, access to justice, sort of authoritarian legality. And that includes sort of a wonderful chapter by Diego on transformative constitutionalism that aligns up with other comparative chapters written with an eye to transformative constitutionalism in Africa and in India. And then, of course, a chapter by Roberto Gagarella on inequality that ties in with that theme. So that's the menu, and I hope that you will taste it, and I hope that you will like it, what we are offering there. So with that, I come to the second point, and that now is a part of the argument that we make mainly in the introductory chapter that has been co-authored by Philipp Dann, our colleague Maxim Bönnemann, who's not with us today, I think, or maybe is listening, and me. And so in this regard, I speak, I think, mostly for the editors of the book. And the argument that we are making in this introduction is that the notion of the global south that defines this and carries the southern turn captures a distinctive constitutional experience. So I'd like to highlight this notion of experience because it's important to us. And this experience has been shaped by both a distinctive context in which constitutional development takes place and by distinctive themes and thematic emphasis that is distinctive to some extent from the global north. So that argument has three points again: the notion of the global south, then the issue of context, and the issue of themes. And I'd like to sort of briefly say something about each. So we think that the notion of global south does describe certain shared elements that distinguish the global south, and these are related to the context and to the themes. But at the same time, the global sort of emphasizes that this is not a strict dichotomy, but it's something that emphasizes the entanglements and even a symbiotic or dialectical relationship with the north. So there is certainly there's no dichotomy, and there's certainly no hierarchy in this north and south. So we don't want to essentialize or other southern jurisdictions, but the very term sort of, I think, emphasizes that the north cannot be without the south, and the south cannot be without the north. And these entanglements are something that then later bring us back to the north, because we think that looking at the north from the south can teach us a lot about the north as well. So what is this shared and distinctive context? And there are two elements, one historical and one contemporary, that I think speak from a lot of the chapters in the book, but also the more general literature. The first sort of distinctive context is the historical legacy of colonialism. Now, these legacies are heterogeneous, very heterogeneous at the micro level or even at the regional level. Latin America is part of the first sort of wave of decolonization, and that makes a big difference. At the same time, at the macro level, there is this commonality that, to put it maybe simply and maybe overly simply, is that the South was colonized and the North was the colonizer. And both were bound together in an imperially structured global order. And this history of colonialism sort of is characterized now by ruptures, but also by continuities. And these continuities, I think, still speak to structures of racism, exploitation, and domination that we see across many countries in the global South. And they feed to some extent into the second sort of contextual element, which is contemporary inequalities and asymmetries at the geopolitical level. So Southern nations still tend to be in a less centric or eccentric, or in older days you would have said peripheral position, both in the world economy, depending on commodity exports, sort of valued lower end of the value chains. In terms of the international legal system, sort of power, how power is allocated at the UN and the Bretton Woods institutions and so on. And of course, epistemically, there still remain these hierarchies, not least in comparative constitutional law, where certain sort of legal products and academic production at centers like in the North America, in the East and West Coast, and in Europe, still is privileged, and unjustly so, over academic production and legal production in the global South. So these arguments, of course, have been made by others, not just by us. And we think that they are usefully encapsulated by the global South context or notion. And to deny relevance to the global South sort of notion would also, to some extent, deny sort of these historical legacies and inequalities that are still relevant today. So with that, we move to the third element, distinctive thing, that is the themes. We've called it themes. You can also call it sort of thematic areas or perspectives of looking at constitutions. And here we get more closely now to doctrine and to case law. And what we have perceived in looking at the chapters and reading the literature is that there are three such themes. The first we've called constitutionalism as a vehicle of socioeconomic transformation. So Chico already alluded to this. So in the face of persistent inequality, constitutions in the South do not just aim at limited government, but they aim at an active state with positive obligations. And most prominently, I think in the literature and in practice, is judicialized socioeconomic rights. That is nowadays sort of encapsulated very much in the idea of transformative constitutionalism, which bears some family resemblance. I'd be interested to hear about that, to the concept of constitucional dirigente. Sometimes colleagues from Portugal complain that transformative constitutionalism is too much credited to an American scholar writing about South Africa, Karl Clare, and that this concept sort of has a much longer and broader pedigree in sort of non-English-speaking Lusophone constitutional development. So that's one theme that Diego has written about, a fantastic chapter that I can only recommend you to read, and as well as the other chapters by Roberto on inequality. I think these are very, very distinctive ideas. So there are some open questions in this regard. There's the question of the engine room. So is rights everything? Are courts everything? What about the branches, other branches? To what extent are they contributing to this transformative constitutionalism? And my own research now is on economic constitutionalism and the questions of what do we do with corporate actors and transnational corporations. This transformative constitutionalism has something to say about that. So that's my own research. So second theme, constitutionalism as a site of struggle for political order, or as Upendra Bakshi put it, a site of state formative practices, which speaks to sort of the challenges of sort of organizing statehood and institutions in often sort of very heterogeneous populations, which has resulted in experiments with sort of multi-ethnic democracy, federalism, legal pluralism, but also favored sometimes sort of periods of authoritarianism and violent internal conflict. Finally, constitutionalism as access to justice and as denial of justice. This is also a theme that is dear to my heart, because it speaks to the profoundly ambivalent and sometimes contradictory nature of law and the state in the South, which are both an instrument of emancipation and of oppression. And we think that this feature is particularly sort of distinct or salient, of course, in societies that are very unequal and heterogeneous, where there is often an issue with sort of populations and don't trust law and the states, and then turn to non-state authorities or legal pluralism. But at the same time, Southern legal orders have developed innovative mechanisms of access to justice that, as the Indian Supreme Court has phrased it, bring justice within the reach of the poor masses. And these are innovations that we don't see in northern jurisdictions in such a way. So to conclude this point, these themes are, I think, they're not exhaustive. There may be other themes possible, and they vary, I think, by region and country, and that's something that we can discuss, but I think there is still some sort of shared experience out there. Finally, last point that is brief, and we'll conclude. What is the significance of this sort of Southern turn and of taking this experience seriously? What is the significance for comparative constitutional law more broadly? And we argue that this taking this seriously has implications for the entire discipline of comparative constitutional law and constitutional law in the North as well. So the Southern turn is in a way a double turn. So first we turn south, but then we also turn back to the North and to the world as a whole. And we do think that the South denotes an epistemic, a methodological, and an institutional sensibility, a way of doing comparative law that is characterized by these three elements: epistemic reflexivity, methodological pluralism, and a need to reorganize and diversify the institutional system of research and of comparative research. So with epistemic reflexivity, we mean, first of all, to accord equal respect to constitutional knowledge from the South, and being open to learn from it and be open to transform the categories and theories that we have developed in the North, studying the entanglements. So we now have more drive and more work being done on the consequences of colonialism for the colonizers. We have debates in Europe about the legacies in public space, in museums, and street names. And we're starting to think how the European Union formed in response to decolonization. So these are issues that I think are now coming on the agenda. The second aspect, methodological pluralism, I think it's taken for granted almost that we do interdisciplinary legal research when we compare. But more specifically, if we want to understand these contexts, colonialism, and the asymmetries that I've talked about, then I think both history and global history and political economy are important, in particular, to understanding sort of these contexts. And finally, then, and with that I conclude, the need to reorganize and diversify the institutional system of research and to intensify and sort of equalize collaborations between North and South is often underestimated. But I think it's a crucial thing to think about. So how can we reorganize sort of the way that research is being done globally, that we collaborate across North and South, who can speak, who gets funding, that concerns issues of language, issues of open access to research and sort of intellectual property rights, and that is often underestimated. We try to do this and implement this to the best extent we can do in our journal, the World Comparative Law. And I can only conclude by saying that everyone is cordially invited to contribute to this journal and to contribute to this debate and to continue the discussion that we tried to kick off with this book. With that, I conclude and thank you for your attention and look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much, Michael, and we will proceed to Roberto Gargarella's presentation.
Thank you very much. You tell me if you hear well, and if not, we find a way. Well, first of all, thanks so much for organizing this, and I'm very happy to see all the faces of very good friends that we used to meet in different Zooms. Or for academics now, the life is very much Zoom-like. Well, my chapter in the book was about inequality and social rights, and I will take this opportunity, to reflect about, to say something about the chapter, and mentioning or highlighting certain issues that I think that may be useful for our discussions in Latin America, in Europe, wherever. So basic questions about constitutional theory, and mainly here related to, the topic of my chapter, which was inequality and social rights. So I will present a little bit the development of social rights in Latin American constitutionalism, but again, not with an interest in history, or not so much, but mainly about critical thinking about, so trying to reflect about what that history teaches us. And I think that it teaches, or at least it poses to us important questions. So let me begin with the 19th century, where the issue of what Hannah Arendt called the social question was mainly absent, not totally absent, in constitutional discussions in Latin America. It was not totally absent because there were voices, particularly at the very first minute after the independence, which recognized that many of those who had been involved, giving their lives to the independent battles, they were living in very extreme conditions of inequality. So that brought the issue of inequality to the fore, but I would say that for different reasons, all these egalitarian concerns that were pushed, I would say, by kind of Rousseauian Republican agents, or tended to disappear right after the independence became consolidated. at this initial point, in for example, in what is today Uruguay, José Artigas, who was the main military political leader of the time, articulated a discourse which included concern for the lives of the marginalized, concern for inequality, concern for even democracy, I would say, which were quite exceptional in the region because, I mean, given the level of articulation, even though he was a quite uneducated person. But here it's this is one example. There were some of these radical priests, for example, in Mexico, who also articulated a more interesting discourse on inequality, particularly because of the issue of the land and the property of the land, or the land in the hands of the church in Mexico was so prominent, so it became such a pressing topic. Or, for example, in Argentina, one independence leader who was quite educated, Mariano Moreno, who was quite influential, translated all Rousseau's, works, those who were available at the time, including the social contract, and that piece was very influential in the region. So there were expressions of these radical Republican, Rousseauian leaders, political activists that at the very first minute articulated this more egalitarian view. But that immediately disappeared from the fora. And this is something that, something very similar happened in the United States after, the independence was consolidated, that all the, as my idol, Gordon Wood, here is said, the people had learned the lesson of self-government that the political leaders, in a way, inculcated to them at that moment in order to move them to the revolution or to the independence. But then, after the revolution, the independence was consolidated, the discourse of self-government completely disappeared from the elite discourse. So that's one interesting thing, which is that in the 19th century, in Latin America, this more egalitarian discourse had, I would say, a few moments of life. I would say mainly two moments. One I mentioned at the very beginning, the other around 1848, when the European revolutions, the democratic revolutions took place. And so that's also came to the region and was important. But what is important from this story? I would say a few things. First is that the constitutions that were written, particularly in the mid-19th century, were in the end written in, say, constitutional discussions where the voices of the Republican, the Rousseauians, were absent. So, in the terms of my article, the engine room of our constitutions, or mainly the organic part of the constitution, or the organization of powers in our constitutions, that part was mainly originated in the 19th century after discussions that were basically expressing the compact between, say, more liberal and more conservative forces, but where the radical Rousseauian views were absent. And this is what happened in Chile. This is what happened in Colombia. This is what happened in Argentina, where, the 1853 Constitution was written out of an agreement between liberal conservative forces, but again, with total exclusion of all the few Republican voices. In Brazil, where after, I would say, a slower constitutional development, the 1891 Constitution was a clear expression of this compact between liberals and conservative, or at least was a text mainly, I don't know, people like Rui Barbosa, others, but it expressed the view of liberals that were gaining power in Brazil after the predominance of conservative forces. So the 1891 Constitution was, in the end, a typical expression of this liberal conservatism in Latin America. But the important point here is that the main structure of our constitutions that were written between 1850 and 1890 was written out of, in the vast majority of cases, out of a compact between liberals and conservatives that live outside behind the Rousseauian radical claims. Those claims, I would say, would re-enter in our constitutional discussions in the 20th century, but not at this moment when the organization of powers was designed. So that's one point. The second point, which also for me is very interesting, is that if you read the speeches or the writings of some of these original radical writings in Latin America, who began to think about the social question. This is a polemic but interesting point, which follows the history of Republican political thought, which is that they didn't put much emphasis on social rights. They were taking seriously the social question, but not the idea, not in terms of social rights. They were not thinking about social rights in general. So there were some spectacular constitutional debates in Mexico in 1857. This was I would say, one of the exceptional cases where a few, but important, influential, radical voices participated in the constitutional discussion. I'm thinking one very important figure at the time, Ponciano Arriaga, Castillo Velasco, Ignacio Ramirez, people like them, which were an exception because was one of the few, very, very few cases, I would say, where radical voices participated in the constitutional discussion. But again, they were not thinking in terms of social rights. They were thinking about the social question. So just to take one quotation, which also for me was always very important, from this Ponciano Arriaga. Ponciano Arriaga say in Spanish, but the idea in Spanish was the Constitution should be la ley de la tierra, no, the law organizing the distribution of land. That's what he meant. So the idea is we need, again, this is one of the few speeches, and influential speeches in the constitutional discussions thinking about the social question. And he didn't say, let's include social rights in the Constitution or something like that. No, he said, let's talk about the agrarian reform. Interesting, in the sense that, like many other Republicans, they were not thinking primarily about rights when they were thinking about the social question. More than that, they were thinking that that could be part of the problem, but that we could talk about later. But so, two issues that for me are important from this 19th century. I will mention three only, but one is the virtual absence of radical voices from the constitutional discussions, with very, very, very few exceptions. So our organization of powers was consolidating. So without the presence of these radical Republican voices, this was not the case in the United States, where radical Republicans at least they were very strong politically, and so they were at least able to challenge the constitutional project. So some of the amendments that were included in the U.S. Constitution came from, for example, the place of the jury. So they came from this radical perspective, but not in Latin America. So they were absent from this constitutional discussion. Second, which is that for those few activists and political leaders who advocated for these more Republican ideas, they were not putting the stress on rights. They were putting the stress on when they were thinking about social question. They were thinking about things like agrarian reform. And the third point, which is also very, very important, is about the way in which we tended to accommodate opposite ideas in our constitutional discussions. And this seemed to be a minor point, but for me, turned to be a super important point, which is there is something that is not obvious what explained this, but I don't think this has something to do with Latin American incapacity, intellectual. No, our constitutional projects in general were very interesting, and there was a lot to learn from them, particularly, I would say, immediately about social rights. But the way we tended to put together our opposite views, the way we tended to model, to construct our constitution, I would say was very controversial and I would say very unproductive or problematic. Let me explain, because it seems confusing, but I would say it's very clear. Every time we have to write a constitution in a multicultural society, in a society that has different ideologies, different cultures, etc., well, we are in a problem because we need to write one common single text for a diversity. So what to write down expressing one view when we have very different views. So there are many things to do, many alternatives about how to put these views together. The best for me would be to try to synthesize, to try to find a one point of common agreement between our different views. So one example, which I take from the US Constitution, which I don't think is an exemplar constitution, but in this point is interesting. So in the case of religion and the Constitution in the United States, you get, well, there were many different views, different sects, religious sects. So there were the Anglicans, the Presbyterian, the Catholics, whatever. And what they wrote is, this is something that John Rawls, mentioned many times in political liberalism, for example. So what they did is they wrote the First Amendment, which says something that all the different views could share, which is no matter who wins the political power, no one will have the authority to impose its own religion to all the other, to the rest. So that's an interesting way to express the different voices in one common text. So this is trying to find a common point, a point of agreement, a focal point. So one common idea that we all share. In Latin America, the usual way was a very controversial way. I don't know if it was because of the difficulties of the negotiation or whatever, but what we tended to do is put one thing over the other, in the sense that many ways, and I can give some examples, we include in the Constitution typically what the liberals wanted, and over that, what the conservatives wanted. So, for example, two examples from the Argentinian Constitution. The Argentinian Constitution includes Article 2, which gives conservatives what they wanted in their or religion. So they doesn't declare an official religion, but it provides a special status to Catholicism. And at the same time, in the same text, we include Article 14, which is freedom of religion, and so religious tolerance. So in the same text, we put what Catholic conservative wanted the most and what liberals wanted the most. Another article, Article 19, which for my professor Carlos Nino was a favorite article. The first line of the article was what John Stuart Mill dreamed, the harm principle. But when they were writing this principle about, so basically all private actions that do not harm other people are protected actions, that the harm principle, and this is still part of the Argentinian Constitution, was John Stuart Mill's dream. The conservatives didn't like that, and so during the Constitutional Convention they say, no, add this second line, which is John Stuart Mill's nightmare. And so they say, we are going to respect privacy as far as your action do not affect public morality, or order. So a mess. So in the same article, you get what the liberals wanted and but again, this is not a showing of stupidity. It's a way of, I think it's a controversial and problematic way of doing constitution, writing constitution, which is, given that we are not able to find a common point of agreement, we put what you want and what I want. And this is expressed also in the organization of powers, which is, we include, and this is all the Latin American constitutions, we include a checks and balances which is what liberals most wanted, following the US example, and we include a stronger executive as conservatives were demanding. So both things at the same time. We don't have now a system of checks and balances, and we don't have a monarch. But we have a combination, which is a very bad thing. But this is the way we tended to do things when we had different ideas. So put one thing under the other. So this is like aggregations, things like that. Well, these 3 points for me are important, and I conclude soon, in order to think about the 20th century and from the 20th century to the present, which is, in the 20th century, something super important happened, which is the Mexican Revolution with the Russian Revolution. But the Mexican Revolution had as a product the 1917 Constitution, which is exemplary in the world. It's an incredible thing, which is like introducing a labor code inside the Constitution. I mean, 2 social articles of the Mexican Constitution 1917 are longer than the entire US Constitution. They have so many things, so many clauses, so many rights, which in a way is fantastic that people at that time, I mean, were able to imagine those claims about social security, about trade unions. It's amazing thing, amazing thing. And we follow that Mexican example from them to the present, and most Latin American constitution copied that model. So including this novelty, this came before the Weimar Constitution. So this was the first constitution in the world, including social commitments in the text. So this is a Latin American, contribution to our discussions on constitutionalism. But again, these follow the same model that we were preparing in the 19th century. Again, an accumulation, an aggregation of a new thing without modifying the previous one. So now we have that these social rights and these social commitments and this social question, or this way of including the social question, which is not the one that the old radicals wanted, but okay, this was the way they found. But so now we have the old traditional model, which is the liberal conservative compact, and above that, we include a third level, a third layer, which is a more social aspect, without modifying all the rest. So we have the same old engine room, the same old machinery, which is liberal conservative, untouched. And above that, we include a new layer, which is all these social rights. That created a problem, and that's for me the main problem in Latin American constitutionalism. So, which has to do also with the way in which we incorporate or we reform our constitutions. So, in order to maintain the compact, in order to, preserve what they did is, I think, is totally wrong, which is they left untouched the old machinery. So that's a point. And 1 or 2 points, and I conclude. I like very much to quote a speech made by the main Mexican political leader at the time of discussing or introducing the Constitutional Convention of 1917. It's a wonderful speech, or in the sense that it's very revealing of the way in which they were thinking about constitutionalism. And I think it reflects the way we start thinking about social rights in the 20th century. So this is the main political leader, Venustiano Carranza. And what he said, we usually don't pay attention to that, but it was very interesting, very important, and I would say very dramatic. A few years ago, 3-4 years ago, we were in Mexico. I was there celebrating the 100th century anniversary of the Mexican Constitution, and I think it deserves admiration because in a way it changed our constitutional discussions. But I always try to emphasize, but we also need to pay attention to the problem, which is reflected in this speech. In the speech, Venustiano Carranza said, I'm modifying what he said, but this is the main message. I'm not modifying the essence. The essence was include all the social rights you want, but don't even dare to modify, to change, to undermine my own power. Why? Because Mexico, as most Latin American societies, need stability and order, and that's what I guarantee. So don't even imagine touching on my powers. So include all the rights you want, but please no. You never don't dare to do that. Well, that was the model. So which was then inaugurated. So many people say, okay, with the Mexican Constitution, something extraordinary happened, and this was the birth of social constitutionalism. I would say it was the birth of social conservatism or social authoritarianism. That's the way we began to organize our constitution. And so the case of Getúlio Vargas in Brazil and the constitutions of 1934 and 1937, for example, or the Peronist constitution in Argentina, which was also extremely important, 1949 constitution. But all these constitutions, which were exemplar in terms of following the Mexican illustration, well, they did the same, which is an authoritarian leader, strong executive power, and a very broad list of social rights, which you include without modifying the rest or even emphasizing or expanding the powers of the executive. So that, I think, is something to celebrate in terms of, well, finally, we remember to include the social rights thing, which in a way we wanted to incorporate. Perhaps this was not the best way. But second, we didn't change the rest of the Constitution accordingly. And so in that sense, we with one hand, we undermine what we do with the other. So and I think that the constitutions that were then modified at the end of the century in Brazil, in Venezuela, in Bolivia, in Argentina, in Colombia, in Ecuador, well, many people said, okay, this is the new Latin American constitutionalism. I would say this is the old Latin American constitutionalism. Why? Because it just expanded what we already have. We had these constitutions that, on the one hand, consecrate an authoritarian power, or at least are functional to the concentration of powers. And on the other hand, we promise wonderful things that we are undermining with what we did and what we didn't change on the other hand. So that's my balance. And that's are many things that I think are able to reflect about Latin American constitutionalism. So about how to incorporate opposite ideas in the constitution, how to think about the social question, how to think about the so-called social constitutionalism. So there are so many, at least for me, interesting questions that come from that point. So I stop there. Thank you. I'm sorry if I extended more than necessary.
Thank you very much, Roberto. And now I will proceed to Jane Reis.
Hello. I have experienced some instability with my connection. So if something go wrong, let me know. I will change to the cell phone. But, well, it's a pleasure to be with you today. Thanks for the invitation. I have read this book with great enthusiasm, and I'd like to congratulate the organizers and authors for this valuable contribution to the field of comparative law. I've organized my comment in 3 parts. First, I will mention some points that captured my attention and renewed my perceptions about this subject matter. Second, I will share some critical concerns about the use of the concept of global south in comparative law. And third, I'll make a short comment about the piece by Roberto Gargarella. I promise to be brief. So, starting with my highlights.
The book's introduction gives a sophisticated, complete, and at the same time schematic overview of methodological difficulties that contemporary comparative law contains, especially when we look at the field through the lenses of Global South. Concerning theoretical contributions, I would like to mention the insightful piece by Florian Hoffmann that addresses the idea of epistemic justice, which is crucial to think about how to study comparative law. Another high point is the timeline of global constitutionalism and the geopolitics of knowledge traced by Christine Schwabel-Patel, which helped me to map and illuminate many theoretical discomforts within this subject matter. The first part of the book really made me think about elements that, as a reader, I would like to see more widely covered in the comparative law research agenda. And they stimulated my other observations, my following observations. The second part of the book is very rich, informative, and opens up several horizons of comparative research within the Global South framework. And I did not see the important concerns discussed in the first part echoed in the second one, which leads to my next remarks. So I will make some friendly criticism. Considering what's included in this volume and what was not covered, I'd like to make a friendly critique about the groups of topics that frame the research agenda offered in the book. The introduction presents a very thought-provoking idea, the one that Global South is not a place, but rather a sensibility and a perspective. At the same time, as the organizers presented in the beginning, the authors outline that comparative law can be thought for the Global South, with the Global South, and from the Global South. The use of these prepositions suggests that, in a way, the relationship between North and South ends up being still mainly geographical. So this makes me wonder whether we should not also contemplate comparative law by the Global South. That is, think about how to transform Global South into a knowledge-making protagonist, into a knowledge-making site. Another point is that the book identifies three distinctive themes that characterize Southern constitutionalism. The first, constitutionalism as socio-economic transformation. The second, constitutionalism as site of struggle about political organization. The third, constitutionalism as denial of and access to justice. In my reading, it seems that the first group of themes, socio-economic transformation, is focused on redistribution. The second, in political organization. The second, political organization, is focused on procedures and institutional design. And the third, access to justice, is focused on participation deficits. That was my reading. I believe the framework of Southern constitutionalism must also include themes related to recognition, as I will explain. The point I would like to discuss is whether we must go beyond these three distinctive themes, since it's fundamental to analyze who is excluded in these three scenarios. That is, who is deprived of socio-economic rights? Who is excluded in the struggles over political organization? And who does not have access to justice? This got me thinking about the nature of the inequalities that define Global South, and wondering if debates about which groups are outsiders shouldn't be at the very core of the Global South definition. The question is whether we can properly explain Southern constitutionalism without focusing on the causes of the exclusion and the features that shape the inequalities in these countries. I mean, to consider problems related to recognition with equal status as redistribution, institutional analysis, and participation deficits. We can find evidence of this difficulty in the first part of the book, theoretic perspective. However, the second part of the book does not cover recognition as a significant component that shaped the notion of Global South. And I don't think we can properly understand and define Southern constitutionalism without studying matters related to racism, to the legacy of slavery, to indigenous populations, and to gender. And this made me wonder about the risk that the concept of Global South might become a mere replacement or a mere substitute of the idea of third world. If issues related to identity and recognition can't have a meaningful place on the comparative research agenda, there's a chance that insightful and important notions brought by the authors, brought by the organizers, such as methodological plurality and equal dignity of North and South, function as somehow ethereal, abstract ideals. There's also a chance that the notion of Global South ends up as an intangible image that serves mainly as a vector with which to contrast the North. About this, who says that Africa has become one of the metaphors through which the West represents the origins of its own norms, develops a self-image, and integrates this image into the set of signifiers asserting what it's supposed to be its identity. So the book raises the profound question of whether and how the idea of Global South can be managed, can be worked without reinforcing, and I quote Mbembe again, the notion of absolute otherness, serving as a focal point for the West to assert its difference from the rest of the world. I think the book certainly lays great ground for these questions to be discussed. So I am already looking forward for the next volume. My third comment is not properly a comment or a statement, is a question about the piece by Roberto Gargarella, which addresses inequality, social rights, and their relation with the history of Latin American constitutions, criticizing, as he showed, their centralized and vertical power structure, strongly unbalanced in favor of executive powers. His point is that the reformers of the late 20th century invested their energies in the legal affirmation of rights without renewing power arrangements, thus leaving those rights at the mercy of old presidential structures. I would like to question if there may be some other historical explanations as to why constitutional reformists have maintained this pattern. Why have they underestimated the role of hyper-presidentialism on the fate of rights? Reading Roberto's piece, I was reminded of the classic book by Brazilian historian José Murilo de Carvalho. The book is called Citizenship in Brazil, The Long Way. Murilo de Carvalho analyzes citizenship as a historical phenomenon related to three dimensions: civil rights, freedom, property, from formal equality, political rights, that is voting rights, and social rights, education, work, health, and social security, and so on. The author maintains that there was no connection between these three dimensions throughout Brazilian history, which caused, in his words, an unfinished citizenship. This notion is, in a sense, close to what Guillermo O'Donnell identifies as low-intensity citizenship, and what was also called as governed citizenship. This notion is, in a sense, similar to what other scholars have analyzed about the evolution of the rights in Latin America, or in different Latin American countries. Murilo de Carvalho draws on Thomas Marshall's examination of the development of rights in England. He believes that these three groups of rights, civil, political, and social, do not involve a chronological order, but rather a logical one. That is, civil rights made it possible for people to claim political rights, and this, in turn, made it possible the struggle for social rights. Differently, in Brazil, social rights were introduced in a period of low political participation and precarious enforcement of civil rights. In the 1930s, social rights were affirmed during the government of Getúlio Vargas, a dictator who later gained popularity and got elected. Carvalho says so that social rights were then introduced as a compensation for the lack of political freedom, in a formula of social paternalism. And then comparing these two perspectives, as I read Roberto's piece, I wondered, and I would be very curious to hear from Roberto on this, if the lack of concern of the constitutional makers of the late 20th century with these centralized state structures, with this engine room, which were maintained in the democratic constitutions they created, could not partially be explained by this historical correlation between strong governments and concessions of social rights. This question may not relate to the history of social struggles in all other Latin American countries, but at least in Brazil, when Roberto, during his talk, quoted the Mexican experience that was similar about this centralization, I wonder if this arrangement of a strong executive preserved even the most democratic constitution of our history, in our case, could have as one of its causes the fact that such rights have previously been introduced through authoritarian consents. This is my commentaries. I look forward to continuing this conversation with you today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jane. And now, Micaela Alterio, please.
Thank you very much. I want to thank for your invitation to this book presentation and discussion about the Global South and comparative constitutional law, organized by ICONES Brazil and hosted by the Institute for Education and Research in Sao Paulo. As part of the ICONES, I feel that we are creating this new space for a global conversation on this kind of topics that have an important impact on visibility and also for improving inner conversation within the souls. So I celebrate this invitation and this comment on the book. I'm going to read because my English is not very fluent, so I'm sorry for that. Well, first, I celebrate the initiative of the book, but broadly, I want to applaud the work that the editor of the book, Philip Dam, Michael Regner, and Maxime Bonneman do at the Verfassung and Recht in Übersee, the World Comparative Law Journal, because it is one of the few spaces to publish and to read about developments in constitutional law from the Global South in English. So I celebrate this kind of spaces. I enjoy reading the book. I think it is a great and high-profile compilation. And for those reasons, I invite people that are here to us to read the book as well. Now, as a commenter of the book, I would like to advance some critical observations to think about the incipient interest in comparative constitutional law, especially from a subaltern perspective. And some of these comments are very in the line that Jane has speak now. Well, the Global South, at least geographically, is huge and very diverse. My studies on Latin American constitutionalism have shown me the enormous difference between constitutional experience in countries such as Argentina and its 1850, Mexico and its 1917 constitution, or, for example, the Andean countries of the new Latin American constitutionalism of the 21st century. These differences are not always noticed by scholars from the global north that engage in comparative constitutional law conversation. As an example, I would want to share with you a personal anecdote. In an ICONES global conference at Denmark, I was talking about some novelties of the Bolivian constitution of 2009, and one scholar replied that Maduro's government was a proof of the failures of this specific approach. That, of course, is in Venezuelan constitution. Of course, this is not the case when we consider the discipline seriously, but I am to say that the level, Global South, as the editors and other scholars in the book recognize, is too extensive to capture such differences that maybe the only thing that has in common is that they cannot be labeled as part of the global north. I, for example, feel absolutely incapable to speak about Asia or Africa. Is for me another word, absolutely. And in that sense, I only will talk a little about Latin American constitutionalism. Another point is a reflection about the categories we use to study the Global South. Mostly, they are imported from the North. As the author of the book's bios corroborate, scholars that can engage in this conversation, mainly because of the language, had studied in universities of the Global North. We have been educated for the mainstream academia, have incorporated and internalized the important discussion of topics, and then back to our countries, we have tried to use or adapt these categories and topics to our realities, measuring the level of accuracy we can find. These criticisms may be unfair for two reasons. One is that there is a lot of critical thinking in constitutional law from the South that is original, but if it does not match at some point the known categories from the North, they remain marginalized. In other words, when those autochthonous experiences have sufficient relevance to be interesting for the global academia, the problem of translation and with it, the problems of those who translate and appropriate in some way an incomplete way, in an incomplete way, those experiences. Some of these critical points are collected in the chapters, in the introduction also, but in the chapters of Christine Chauvel, Pattern, and Soran Oklopsik. The other reason, because maybe the criticism I said before is not fair, is that scholars use categories that their own local constitutionalism borrow from the North. In many occasions, to use them as a facade to legitimize poor constitutional developments. In this sense, the contribution of Diego Vermeck and his concept of mission accomplished syndrome, or of Roberto Niembro and its authoritarian constitutionalisms, are good examples. But well, I will make my last point. During all the reading of the book, one parallelism came to my mind. This is the one between the Global South perspective and the gender or feminism perspective to constitutional law. In both approaches, we found the need to show how the global north, or the masculine, even if hegemonic, is not universal, and hides the power relations and the subordination of some voices, those of the global south, those feminines, that are not taken seriously, not even heard or legitimized. This attitude is starting to change, but again, as soon as the new voices are heard, you realize the huge difference you can find within them, and how a unique approach or level is insufficient to grasp the sea of experience and the intersectionalities that go through them. In any case, my point here is that one of the engines of change in law approaches is, with no doubt, and in my opinion, social movements. They work for challenging law interpretation from a feminist perspective, and also to challenge constitutional law comprehension from the South. As an example, I would like to take the, again, in my opinion, most interesting constitutional movement taking place at this moment, the Chilean constitutional process. The novelty and the promise of subversion that it presents has to do with its egalitarian promise. One of the, I think, most interesting characteristic is the first time in the world that it's going to be a constitutional assembly composed in a paritarian way. It's 50-50% for men and women. And the agenda. I think the agenda that feminist constitutionalism is advancing in it. It is challenging, this process is challenging some of the most consolidated assumptions of global liberal constitutionalism. The social contract and its consequent division between the public and private spheres, incorporating the discussion about the sexual contract, as Carol Pittman named it a long time ago. In this sense, feminist constitutionalism is reshaping traditional borders of constitutional law from a subaltern and also southern perspective, including the constitutional interest for care work, for distribution of domestic chores and its economic implications for sexual and reproductive rights, emphasizing the redefinition of classic concepts as autonomy or equality. In this respect, it called my attention that the book is silent about the different social movements in general and on feminist constitutional in particular. If one of our common concern is equality, this kind of experiences promise to be especially transformative. Particularly, I was struck by the fact that out of a total of 14 contributions, there is only one from a woman. I know sometimes this is not a voluntary output of the editors, but in the book is shocking that it's only one woman. I think this is a weakness of the book that exemplifies how even within the global South there is a South. So, well, thank you for this opportunity to comment to you. I like the book very much. And well, I will enjoy a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Micaela, and thank you to all our panelists for thought-provoking presentations. I have a couple of questions that I received on WhatsApp, but I might just begin by adding one of them, and then I'll allow the panel to speak again and also interact with one another. So the question is from Stefania Barbosa, who is the co-chair of ICONES Brazil. And Stefania says that she refers to the common criticism of borrowing of Global South courts, borrowing case law and ideas from North courts. And while she understands that in some contexts, especially socioeconomic rights, we should be suspicious of those automatic borrowing of ideas, she observes that in other issues like women's rights, it is very important to use these North courts decisions that expand women's rights as a powerful argument to persuade not just other judges, but also as a moral justification to a conservative audience. In Brazil, for example, she uses an example where women's rights are facing a conservative attack, and this attack has ties with what she refers to the Christian nationalism projects. Just an example of how the practice of borrowing by courts might lead to different evaluations, might be normatively ambiguous. And her question is, what's the Global South take, and what would be your take on the problem of South courts borrowing liberal decisions by North courts? I guess I would summarize it like this. And then I will proceed. Maybe we can just keep the same order as the presentations. So I begin with Michael, and then we follow all the way to Micaela. Okay, so Michael.
If someone else feels like to want to have an urgent reaction, I don't need to start because I started earlier. Again, raise your hand if you want to go first.
Sure.
Otherwise, I'd like to, just very briefly, thank you so much for sort of engaging so deeply and in such a thoughtful way with the book. This goes to the commentators, of course, and also to the question. That's really the kind of, I think, debate we wanted to kick off, and we depend on you and comments and input from you to make this sort of more inclusive. So this is definitely we're expanding the collaboration, and we hope to take that further in the future. So thank you very much. Let me say three things. So first, raise this point on how does the theory and the theory chapters and maybe the introduction relate to the more thematic chapters in the second half. And I think that's a point I want to emphasize about the way that we went about to produce this journal. So unlike other projects, we did not have a sort of theoretical frame that we imposed on our authors from advance. So we did not have sort of, say, a theory about the Global South that we wanted our authors to reflect on, that we submitted to them now using and contribute. It was rather the other way around. We wanted to first listen and then also at the conference, but then also read the chapters. And what we did then with the introduction was very much an inductive project. So it's definitely not the fault of our authors if sort of they haven't implemented something that we had in mind. And it's really just us trying sort of giving our own 5 cents to to what others have produced. And I think that that's something that I'd like to highlight. Of course, that the authors are from the South, and that's what we wanted to sort of bring out with the book. And then, of course, later reflect on that. So that's why it's maybe not as sort of tightly integrated as other projects, but I would consider that as maybe more of a strength than a weakness. Precisely, and this brings me to the second point, because it does bring out the diversity, the immense diversity of the Global South. And I fully agree there, of course, with Michaela, that as a region and as legal systems, the Global South is massively heterogeneous, very different historical experiences, colonial experiences, and there is so one should not essentialize these legal systems and say that they're the same. I think that's important. At the same time, I think knowing that how global discourse and comparative constitutional law work, we still think that the notion sort of Global South is important, maybe, as I said, as a political vehicle to raise attention, sort of, and to bring in this full force of the sort of ignored and neglected constitutional experiences. And I think with that, the claim of sort of the South is a stronger claim than to say, this is from Bolivia. So I would agree with you sort of that we should not neglect this, but I would hope that sort of using this notion would just further the substantive goal in the program, which is to bring this to the attention of larger audiences. So that's the thing. The other point that I think Jane made, and I found very interesting and would need to reflect more on, is the idea, so does the way that we then interpret the notion of the Global South capture everything, or does it in turn exclude something? And my understanding of the Global South, of course, is very much that it has this emancipatory sort of impetus to include the excluded. So we hope to capture. The themes that I said are very much not exhaustive, and I'd be very happy to think about another theme. In a normal setting, I would now ask you the question, so would recognition be a fourth theme, and what would we understand by it? Would it be more related to identity, sort of an ethno-cultural issues, or gender issues? And we'd be happy to sort of discuss and open to it. Last point that I think Michaela completely rightly made, gender and feminism. I fully agree with you that there's a deficit in the book, and it's a deficit that we perceived and that we reflect on in the introduction. So we've made our point there that this is something that we need your help to improve. And I think in the journal we're doing a lot better than in the book. We have near sort of parity when it comes to the journal authors most of the time. With the book, it happened that many of the women we invited to come to the conference or to contribute to the book couldn't contribute or dropped out relatively late. And that's not good. But we need to ask ourselves, and this is why we included this issue about institutions, what are the institutional barriers for women? Why do we not get, when we ask them, why is it difficult to find them in the first place, of course? And that also speaks to mechanisms of exclusion in academia in the South. And then when you find them, why is it difficult for them to do what many men are able to do, to contribute to this book? And this is sort of certainly a systemic problem, and it's not at all a problem sort of the women that cannot often overwhelmed or face these barriers. So we need to work to reduce these barriers. And I think, as I said, in the journal, it seems to be working a lot better. With the book, I fully agree with you that is not ideal. It must be improved. So I hope for the next volume we will have you on board and then include these themes that you are more competent to talk about than we are.
Thanks, Michael. Roberto?
I can say something, yes. First, thank for the excellent readings of the book and comments. I'm very happy to listen to those comments. Just a few reactions, but thinking about, one is about the alternative explanations. I don't know, maybe we agree, but or not. But I see that the main explanation for most of the things that happen and do not happen, institutionally speaking, in the region, and I would say in general in an egalitarian, in unequal countries, is inequality. I know it's perhaps too easy explanation or too quick explanation, but the more I reflect about that, I think that the inequality is the source of many of the evils we have in the region. We were born in the independence, after the independence, and we were already, having with 400 years of strong inequality imposed by the Spanish or the Portuguese Empire, and that I think was not solved by the independence, and it was not solved by the constitution making process, and it was not solved with the inclusion of rights. So the first book I dedicate to this is The Legal Foundations of Inequality, because I was already thinking that our constitutions and the development of our constitutional life in part express inequality, reflect inequality, and reproduce inequality. So the concentration of power and the elitism that we have at the constitutional level is an expression of the social economic inequality we have. And so it would have been very strange to have egalitarian constitutions coming out from unegalitarian, unequal countries. So I need to think more and about many other peculiarities coming from the particular history of our different countries, but I guess that would be very difficult to move from that root explanation. I think that's sad, but I think that explains a lot. So that's also why, to make a normative point, I think that the main tragedy that we confront and that we should try to do something, with all the means that are close to us, in our control or somehow under our control, is to fight inequality. So I understand that it's very difficult. But it's like the Baron Munchausen paradox, that you can't stand up. So it's very difficult to get to an egalitarian solution from an inegalitarian context, but at least we need to be aware of that, be aware of the problem and try to do something. And there are a few things I think we can do. So to put a very, very minor thing, we know that we can improve substantially access to justice to the more marginal people, and we know that it's possible to distribute a decision-making process, or so in kind of Micaela was talking about the constitutional discussions in Chile, but we could talk about the constitutional discussions in Ireland or in Iceland and so it's possible to have, or the discussion about abortion in Argentina, it's possible to have discussions which are more, say, democratically distributed, that they are more inclusive. That's also possible even in the context of inegalitarian countries. I think the problem is to make those alternatives stable. So I think that the old powers would do everything they could in order to boycott these solutions or to co-opt these solutions or to control or to colonize these solutions. That's what's happening. So, for example, I was very much in favor of opening from the judicial bench public popular audiences or public hearings. That I think is great, and this we have great cases in Brazil, in Argentina. But then again, the problem is colonization. No? So the whole elite system is going to control that. So there is a fight, but the fight is going to go better at least in order to go better, at least we need to be aware of the kind of problems we confront. And I think that was not so clear before, and it's more clear now. So that's my hope, that there are alternatives and we have more clarity about where to go, where to head to. And another small point about what was Micaela saying about the Chilean thing. I think it's really the process we need to look at, and it's very promising. My skepticism has to do with this same point, which is, and I see this is happening in Chile already, that the right-wing coalition is going to have, of course, a bit of power in all solutions. So it's great, and it's going to make a difference. First, that there is a social pressure from below. That's there, and that's important. And second, I mean, this egalitarian distribution of seats, or the fact that even, I mean, members of the indigenous communities are going to have fixed seats. That's so feminist groups, but I mean, it's going to be gender inequality, but also it's going to be, I mean, special seats for represent. So that's absolutely decisive, and that's crucial. That's very important for the legitimacy of process. But the fact is that given the procedures that have been already established, the right is going to have veto power, and so it's going to be very difficult to introduce substantive changes. And the discussions, in a way, already are showing that they are going to reproduce some of, I think, our problematic assumptions. No, so okay, more rights, but then more or less the organization of power stay in place. So I'm afraid of that. I'm afraid that we are not going to get what we could have gotten. But of course, it's going to be extremely important to leave behind the Pinochet's legacy. So in that sense, we need to pay attention to that. And also the final point about that I mean, in a society that was usually accused for the passivity and of the citizens, I mean, the same in Brazil. I mean, until very near, I mean, we had this idea that, well, no, people in Brazil do not take part in politics, which was false. But today we see, I mean, that the citizens are very active in Brazil, in Chile, like I mean, they have been here or in Bolivia or wherever. So about that, I have confidence. Know that there is this sense of empowerment in the democratic empowerment, I would call it, in Latin America, which is a good news among many other bad news. No, so the pandemic times have ratified many of our old vices, institutional vices, like more concentration of power, police abuses, etc. But the citizenry is activated and still activated, I mean, in this catastrophe, and that's the good news within the dark panorama, dark picture. So that, I would say that, just only that.
Thank you. Jani?
Sorry, I was muted. About the point Michael mentioned in the end about refining a little bit this idea of identity. One point that captured my attention in the book is the absence of, besides the points that Michaela has very well addressed, is the absence of discussions about racism and indigenous people that are at the very core of global South constitutionalism, and distinguish the constitutionalism in these areas, and they are reduced to socio-economic questions, as I see in the framework and in the divide presented by the book. So many questions, many inequalities in those countries, in the North too, but especially in the countries that integrate the so-called global South. And I say that I have written already a piece using this concept. So I'm sharing a discomfort that emerged reading this collection. So I'm sharing my concerns with you. And I think race, the way we address indigenous populations, the way we address gender, are points that can't be reduced to access to justice and socioeconomic rights in a way that Nancy Fraser frames redistribution, recognition, participation. I think recognition is central in the analysis of these questions, these problems that we face in comparative law in general, and especially in comparative law within this framework of Global South. About Stefania's question, we have an experience, and I think that speaks to the piece by Diego about the STF and the mission accomplished syndrome, and the use of progressive causes to empower the court or to make a better image for the court without some effect on society many times, and many decisions borrow from progressive judgments in countries in the north in a colonized attitude, incorporating these judgments as something more sophisticated, as a device to show culture or refinement. But my worry about this question of the borrowing in this context is that the other way around is also possible. For example, now the United States have a conservative Supreme Court, and I already see between Brazilian scholars, between Brazilian judges, some influence and some enthusiasm with this composition and with these possible rulings. And so the opposite may happen too. The migration of conservative judgments, or the migration of backlash, is possible too. This would be, if I understood the question, this would be my concern about this phenomenon.
Thanks, Jani and Micaela.
Yes, thank you, and thank you for your comments. I only will engage a little with the Stefania question, because this kind of topic is one in which from the Global South we have a lot to share with not only the Global North, but between us. And I think at least this that I call feminist constitutionalism, that is maybe a new or incipient discipline, is taking a lot of force from the social movement in the South, at least in Latin America. I think the problems that women in Latin America, but also in, I will say the other part of the Global South, are really different from the problems that women from the North are living. Are harder. I think by the feminist violence, the lack of recognition of sexual and reproductive rights in the South have made that women organize and fight in a maybe because of the globalization. I don't know how to say, in the Global South, and an experience as Argentinian in this January that legalized abortion, but also, for example, the system of care of Uruguay, the fight in Mexico against feminicide, and now the Chilean new process of constitutionalism are good examples of how this mobilization, these shared battles that we have in the South are gaining place. And in the sense of your question, I think this kind of backlash that maybe Brazil is living today, it's also part of the problem in the United States and also in East Europe with Orban and all this traditional and family renewal in constitutional law. But I can see it with a little hope, because I think this kind of discussion in law. Do you hear me?
Yeah, we lost you for like 4 seconds. So if you can backtrack for 4 or 5 seconds and resume your sentence, that would be great.
I was saying that
we are experiencing technical difficulties with Micaela. Let's wait for 5 more seconds, 10 more seconds. I hope it's not permanent, but so here's what. Okay. Now we have you back. So now we lost you for 20 seconds. So if your connection is more stable now. Okay.
Well, I disappeared.
No, now you're back. Wait, okay, Micaela's back.
Sorry.
So that's okay, please.
That's in the moment. No, well, the point I want to do is that I think this backlash and all this discussion is a sign of maturity, of to go deeper in our constitutional discussion, because the point here is the disagreement about key concepts in constitutional law that are not only in the Global South, rising in the Global South, but are also now in the Global North. So, so 2 points. One is hope. We are more organized. Globalization and Zoom live permits more interchange, more sisterhood in our battles. And on the other hand, we have to engage this conversation with these constitutional disputes about our understandings of family, human rights, but also different groups, of course, rights that are in danger. So, sorry, I don't know if something of this have any sense. I hope it has, and thank you again.
Thanks so much. I would have a couple of questions and comments, but our time is up and we can sure have other opportunities to talk. So thank you to our panelists for this wonderful session, and specifically thanks to Jeanne and Micaela for the engagement with the book. And it was a great session. Stay well, stay safe. Hope to see you guys in the future very soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.